All right. Apologies for those of you who have now been kicked out of this meeting on multiple occasions. I assure you it is not your fault. Um, and I also don't believe it's my fault. The good news is it seems like with each. Oh, Andrew's here and potentially coming in for tech support. All right. Let's try. I see Kevin is here. Kevin, I'm making you co-host again. Excellent. Okay. It's funny, each time we reboot this panel, I feel like we get a new assortment of names, including some names that I do recognize. So I was kind of in the middle of introducing myself, though I am the least important person in this room right now. I was also going to put in a plug for I run a seminar series in the fall, and that is free and open to the public. So if you're interested, I will add a link to the sign up page in the chat room. So a little shameless self promotion there before we get started. Excellent. All right. Again, yeah, I see Stephen. I think this is kind of going on across the board. I'm not 100% sure why that's the case, but hopefully we are up and running with this panel and will not be getting removed here. So with that hope in place, allow me to introduce our guest speaker today. So this is panel, A Striking Switchman, Railroad Worker Unrest and Unionism in the United States and Canada from 1888 to 1917. And with us today talking about that very topic is Kevin Kipers, who is a PhD candidate of history over at Washington State University. His interests involve labor, capitalism, and the history of the United West during the late 19th century and early 20th century. In addition to his research, he serves as TA and an instructor for courses at Washington State University. During his years as an undergraduate and master's student, he's also conducted study in public history and interned for numerous archival organizations. Kipper started his path toward a doctoral degree at Wazoo in 2017, where his current research focuses on resistance to the rise of industrial capitalism in the US and Canada during the Progressive Era. So please join me in giving Kevin Kippers a warm welcome, and very excited to hear about this topic. And I will continue to run the door. So as people file in, I'll let them in. And Kevin, I believe you should be able to screen share if you have a presentation you'd like to share.
Yes, let's see if I can pull it up here. Okay, there we go. Do that for a second though and put it into presentation mode. Sorry, just bear with me for a second. Well, no, that might not work. I'll just go with it as it is. Okay. So thank you, Alex, for that introduction. As mentioned, I'm Kevin Kipers. I will be talking about Switchmen, mostly in the railroad industry during the Progressive Era, and my research focuses on labor unionism and unrest in both the US and Canada from around 1888 to 1917. And why I chose those years, I'll get into a little bit as I go along. But start off with talk about just my general research premise. So basically what I'm examining and then some of the basic questions I'm looking to answer in my research, what I look to contribute. So basically resistance to the rise of industrial capitalism during the Progressive Era. So, and from railroad workers in particular, and I'll also talk a little bit more about why I chose the Switchmen in particular, but some of the central questions I'm looking to answer within this project are, what was the nature of the relationship of the laborers to capitalism? So not just in terms of financially, which we tend to think when we talk about economically, but also in terms of their relationships with both their employers and then also some of their fellow employees. I'll get a little bit more into that, how that worked in the railroad industry in particular, but then also the other central question I'm looking to answer here is, how did laborers resist capitalistic practices? So whether it was through strike activity or arbitration, these were the two most common ways that they went about doing this, but get a little bit more into how they did that as I go along here. So first of all, some other questions. Why focus on the railroad industry, and then why the switchmen within it in particular? So of course, railroads enabled industrial expansion across the country by the back half of the 19th century and then into the early 20th century. So I look at the laborer's perspective and then how did they contribute to this as a process? So that they were kind of the central players among this. And then I have a question here about the difference between capitalism and industrial capitalism. And I think I might get into that in the Q&A session, if that's all right, maybe save it for that. But anyway, so in terms of some of the existing literature on craft unionism from the secondary side of it, that there is a vast amount of literature about craft unionism within the railroad industry, but usually when it's talked about, it's usually from the perspective of those in the four main brotherhoods. So in the running trades, so you have the engineers, the brakemen, the conductors, among others, are often talked about. And so I'd look to talk about the status of the switchmen within the industry. And within this literature, they often are talked about, but more as secondary and more as in the background, and often how they actually helped a lot of those within the brotherhoods. And that was not only was that not always the case, but quite often they played a very central role, and oftentimes for their own benefit, especially after the early 1890s, which I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along too. So mainly my contribution is to look at the role then of the switchmen's unionism in particular. So whether it was, again, through arbitration or through strike activity or what have you. Keep trying to go forward, and it's not letting me do that every time. Anyway, so now from a geographical standpoint, why the US and Canada? So not only did the railroads enable industrial expansion during the Progressive era, but westward expansion itself, that before railroads, people did resettle across the country in the West via horse and buggy or some other way, but usually that was a slower process and often hazardous if they were lucky enough to survive it at all and make it to the West to resettle. So railroads were very important for speeding up that process and making it a lot easier to go from one end of the continent to the other, especially by the turn of the 20th century. And then railroads, as I mentioned before, also incorporated commerce across the continent. That the way it was before is that, like, for instance, in the West, that mining was a heavy industry. And while you had the workers on that end of it, a lot of times the executives and the companies that oversaw and owned these companies still tended to be largely centered along in the East Coast a lot of times. And there was often this feeling of disconnect between those across each side of the country or the continent in general. But the railroads really helped to not only speed up the process of trade and transport across the country, but it felt like there was more of a direct connection between them. And then why I bring in Canada into this as well is that there was also heavy construction of railroads in Canada during this time. And Canada was relatively new as an independent nation at this time. It had only recently, in 1867 at this point, gained independence from the British as a colony, but then also that they included workers along craft lines, same as in the US, including switchmen, and often they were in contact with each other directly, not in isolation even, but often in the same unions. Okay, so then my research methodology in terms of sources that I will use, just a few of the important groups of primary sources I plan to use to contribute to this is, first of all, to bring in the workers' perspective into this, which is very important. And largely the two unions that I focus on are from the perspective of the Switchmen's Union of North America and then the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen. And the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen wasn't exclusively made up of switchmen, but it did include a good number of them, and oftentimes, sometimes even more switchmen than different chapters of the Switchmen's Union itself. And again, each of these particular unions had membership in both US and Canada, a little bit more in the US, but there were some in Canada as well. And then secondly, while the bottom-up perspective is a big part of my contribution here, the business records of railroad companies are also really important to get the perspective of the companies themselves in terms of their policies, their interactions, the nature of their interactions with employees, particularly along the lines of arbitration processes. So some of the two most important on that end will be the Northern Pacific Railway and then Grand Trunk Railway, both of which had lines that ran through both Canada and the US. And then arbitration records so far have also turned out to be pretty important to my research so far into kind of illuminating the nature of strike activity and or what would turn into strike activity if arbitration didn't take place, but kind of the issues that railroaders face that they would bring up, whether it was wages, whether it was hours or conditions. These were some of the most common that came up. And then also important is newspaper articles of strike activity. That this gets a different perspective. This is more from an outside public perspective of strike activity. And depending on what era it was in, the perception of whether strike activity was viewed favorably by the public heavily varied a lot. And that at times that some saw it were actually very much behind them and saw it as a noble cause, whereas others at other times saw it as more of a nuisance. It's holding up railway traffic, it's holding up deliveries, that kind of thing. It's like just basically they should shut up and do their jobs, that kind of thing. And again, that kind of varied a little bit by time period, but that's also important to kind of get also a basic idea of what generally occurred. And then from records like arbitration, that sort of thing, or the Switchmen's Journal, we also get insight as to what the perspective was of the workers themselves from more the inside. Okay, and then in terms of key events I'll cover, just to name some of them here, why I begin and end when I do as well. So why I begin in 1888 is that was the year that we had the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy strike on the railroads. And well, I've talked a little bit about craft unionism and how railroaders were very much separated along craft lines a lot. There were early attempts during this time to kind of federate across union lines. And during this strike, there were attempts to do that. And the Switchmen themselves, at the time they were called the Switchmen's Mutual Aid Association, that not only did they take part in strike activity, but a lot of times they would actually assist in along other craft lines, whether it was the engineers or the conductors or the brakemen or whatever. They often would play a role in providing aid, whether it was to put in more strikers, to provide financial aid or food or supplies or what have you. That there were attempts to federate during this time a lot, and they would play an important role in it. And that kind of brings me into 1893, where we get the formation of the American Railway Union. And this was really the most notable of its kind to formulate, and it had membership across craft lines. It didn't discriminate by craft lines, whereas up before this point, it was largely along the lines of separate brotherhoods, like Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, Firemen, Brakemen, that they tended to be separated more along craft lines. And while not all of them were on board with that at that time, there were some pretty successful attempts for them to federate along those lines at this time. And Eugene Debs was one of the most critical and in formulating the American Railway Union. And in the early months, this was also incidentally, excuse me, during the same year as the Panic of 1893. And this was not coincidental. A lot of times when strike activity would occur, not so coincidentally, it would often be during a recession. And during the Panic of 1893 in particular, this is where we see proposed wage cuts within a lot of railway industries. And so the American Railway Union, during its early months of formation, gained membership and often struck and successfully along the lines to try to keep those cuts from happening. And in the early months, they actually did. And into early 1894, that actually did happen at first. So there was some momentum for federation, and they were scoring some victories and and getting what they asked for. But then in 1894, starting in May, we get the Pullman strike that year. And of course, this is heavily researched and talked about in the literature. And so I'd like to contribute to that is the Switchmen's particular role in that, and and the role they played not only in the Federation, but in the strike itself. And of course, after this point, after a couple of months, the Pullman strike did ultimately fail, and a lot of the leaders, including Debs and some of the strikers, were arrested and tried. And then this also had an important effect among workers themselves, that Debs on this perception that they could successfully get what they wanted across craft lines would work, kind of lost his credibility there. And so it was common after that to see a return to working more along craft lines. And the Switchmen themselves were no exception to this, that within a few months, they reformulated into the Switchmen's Union of North America and kind of became, similarly to the Brotherhoods traditionally, kind of their own particular organization that worked for their own interests a lot. In 1898 is the passage of the Federal Erdman Act, which was important in terms of changing some of the rules about arbitration and laws about it. That, for instance, one of the most significant is that workers could not be fired during the process of arbitration by their employers, that kind of thing. But it also did come with some definite drawbacks. And one of the most notable of these is that it did not obligate employers to go through arbitration, even if the unions would put it to a vote and then overwhelmingly they would favor it. That oftentimes when they try to go through arbitration, it was often turned down. And so even though strike activity would often be seen as kind of a last resort, often arbitration would kind of lead to that, or attempts to arbitrate would kind of lead to that, because they would be unsuccessful a lot of times. And so while the Erdman Act did kind of give more of a voice and at attempts to arbitrate, the fact that it didn't obligate employers to arbitrate if they saw fit was definitely a flaw in that. And then some of the last two key events that I look to bring into this, and one of the most that I'm most excited about in my research, is the Switchman strikes from late 1909 and through much of 1910. That the initial strikes started in December of that year, and compared to the Pullman strike, that's one that lasted about 2 months. And the Switchman strike, at least that initial one, there was a separate Grand Trunk strike that started in July and went into August, and that involved the Switchmen in a lot of ways. But that first one lasted 4 months, so like twice as long as the Pullman strike. And yet the Pullman strike receives all kinds of scholarly attention, yet the Switchman strike, amazingly, there's a lack of secondary literature and attention to this particular strike. So that's definitely one area that I hope to shed a little bit more light on and talk about a little bit more. And then why end in 1917, although there's certainly other disputes of unionization and arbitration I could talk about into the 1920s and 30s. Why end in 1917 is this is the year we get the passage of the Federal Adamson Act. And what this was significant for was the 8 hour, it granted workers, not just in the railroad industry, but in general, the 8-hour workday. As before that, they would often work long hours, no regulations on that across the board. It was pretty much left to the discretion of the employer. And a lot of secondary literature does talk about the brotherhoods and the running trades and their role in getting the Adamson Act to go through legislation and get passed. So again, I look to bring in the Switchmen's point of view on that. What role did they play in that? So now to finish off, so as with anything we do in research, there's always that so what question. So what this really contributes and why this is important. So again, to show that the Switchmen played an important role in the arbitration and strikes, they weren't just secondary and in the background and always necessarily working across craft lines, that many times, especially after the Pullman strike, they would work for their own interests themselves, much like they did. And that the rise of craft unionism, like anything in history, we always talk about contingency, that nothing's inevitable, and that craft unionism was not necessarily inevitable, that we have earlier strikes like the railroad strike of 1877, and during that era, when in much of the 1880s, that it was largely across the brotherhoods and kind of for themselves and not for everybody within the industry. Then you have the shop craft trades sort of at the bottom of the hierarchy within this, often made up of immigrants and lower paid workers. And the Switchmen were somewhere kind of in between. You had the running trades kind of at the top of that hierarchy that tended to benefit the most, often white male, probably not so coincidentally, and the Switchmen, because of the nature of their work, often worked with people across craft lines and were in constant communication with them. But anyway, earlier on, they did play a role in trying to federate across craft lines. And so it's always interesting to think that if the Pullman strike, I mean, there's always that what if question in history, but if the Pullman strike hadn't failed, if it had had more success, would it have gained more momentum, and might there have been more attempts to federate over time even more successfully? I mean, we don't know, but the point being that it didn't necessarily have to happen that way, that the Pullman strike and its failure definitely kind of played a role in kind of a return to working along craft lines a little bit more instead of federating across them. And then lastly, also, I feel what is significant to my research here is just to shed more light on the transnational side of railroader resistance, that in general, that railroad workers were, again, in contact directly within organizations and unions. And it also wasn't uncommon in general for people to move back and forth across the US-Canadian border during this time. This was especially before border patrols really became heavily regulated. I think a little bit more after World War I, but not only south from Canada to the US, but vice versa too, especially by the late 19th century, when there was all this concern about this closure of the frontier and trying to get an affordable homestead and that kind of thing, that many of them went north into Canada because they saw it as a better opportunity to obtain that goal ultimately. So anyway, to show that these didn't happen along nationalistic lines strictly, and that a lot of the similar processes with railroad building and expansion were happening during this time in both countries, and that a lot of workers in similar crafts faced a lot of the same similar issues, and often in communion with each other, not in isolation again. And that's it. Okay.
Excellent. Well, please join me in giving Kevin Kipers a round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this research.
Hi, Kevin. We have some questions for you.
Yeah, I see some of those in the chat box here.
Oh, here's the first one.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
Okay, so the question is, what is the difference between capitalism and industrial capitalism? The question was asked by someone early on in the talk.
Okay, so I guess that's always kind of the slippery slope, and kind of the tricky part of this is what constitutes capitalism. And when I talk about industrial capitalism, what I'm referring to, that is a good question. That what I'm referring to is along the lines of, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly, I guess I'm talking about in the West in particular, like in the East, we see this even by the early 20th century, or early 20th, early 19th century, sorry, that I talk about in terms of factories and that kind of thing, and how, and what I'm really focusing on here is what I mean by that is how the building of railroads really kind of helped expand that out to across the continent to the west, that it kind of played a big part of that. And that's sort of the irony of it, that there was a lot of resistance to, you know, factory kind of labor in that time, like wage labor, that kind of thing. Whereas I guess I mean, as opposed to agrarian labor that came before that. That's, and then and then also this kind of changing we see of hierarchies, that we start to see more and more pronounced class differences. So I hope that answers your question.
I hope so. Judy wants to know, what is a switchman?
Okay. So as I mentioned, there was many groups of craft lines within there. And so the switchmen were responsible for operating the flow of traffic, basically. Like, it's sometimes in kind of what's in the name, switchmen, that they would sometimes switch up the tracks or that kind of thing, or they might stop traffic, or they'd be in communication with, but trying to say that this train had to move in this direction while another one had to move here. And that's what often made this kind of hazardous too. And often in the arbitration that came up, that was often a point of it. It's not just wages, which was a common one, but working conditions. Like oftentimes the tracks would be too close together, that kind of thing. Like you'd have some in a tower, and making communication of those down below, that kind of thing. And I feel like it's a little bit hard to kind of explain what that is, but it's basically they would sometimes get on the trains, or they would uncouple the cars and that kind of thing, which also could make their work kind of hazardous at times, if especially along moving trains. And sometimes the track lines would be too close together, so they might get caught between a couple of different cars and lose limbs, and that kind of thing was often a point of contention, that whether they would be compensated.
Thanks. Okay, Wes wants to know if you could speak to your research in terms of health and safety of the switchmen.
In terms of
health and safety of the job, yeah.
Okay, health and safety. Okay, I heard the safety parts. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I don't know necessarily if you're looking for something specific, but in terms of safety, yeah, that was definitely a big part of it. That again, and what came out in a lot of these arbitration hearings, when a lot of, like, they not only had switchmen testify or railroad workers testify a lot of times, but quite often they would bring in people from other types of work, whether it was iron workers or carpenters or that kind of thing. And many times, many of them testified that it was not only among the more dangerous of the occupations within the railroad industry, but in general, and yet they seem to be making less of a wage than a lot of other people, working longer hours. And it also largely varied by region that they were in, like those who were in Chicago or Minneapolis, where a number of the strikes I look at took place or were centered. That in the winter, of course, you would have harsh winters and cold weather, and they would talk about how it would sometimes they couldn't always see very well, or they weren't always well sheltered when it snowed, or when the temperatures were really severe. And what they had within the Switchmen's Union, they had, like, they would kind of help compensate a lot of times for those that received injuries. That some of them would go through insurance companies, but they wouldn't always get the compensation there that was really necessary for them and their families, or sometimes it would vary by cases of death. Like they would count fatalities a lot of times in their records and their data by just injured or by those who died, and that there would be different rates they'd be given based on that, based on what the nature of the incident was. And of course, companies that always try to, through arbitration, try to find ways around that. It's like, well, technically this happened, but it's like, well, we'll compensate for this much, or for death, this was like the going rate. I don't know if that's what you're looking for in particular, but hope that answers that question.
Well, that answered a couple. There was just a couple of them. Did they lose hand and feet? And then someone else said, were they railroad injuries were part of the expired debs to do organizing? So it looks like you answered a couple of questions. Were hands and feet mainly an occupational injury of switchmen?
I don't know if it was mainly of switchmen because of the nature of their job, it would happen a lot. I mean, there were others in the running trades that faced some of those similar hazards as well. I don't know. There was definitely kind of a consensus that that this seemed to be more of an incidence among switchmen, as opposed to, like, the engineers were kind of top of the hierarchy, and it's like they were supposed to be the most privileged. Like, everybody wanted to work up to that, but it's like, they seem to work with it the most directly. It does seem like it was more of a hazard for them. I don't know. Again, I wouldn't say it was necessarily particular to them, but I would say that it did seem to be maybe a higher incidence of it. But that was often a common complaint that came up through arbitration or strikes, that they would lose body parts. And then, like, there was a movement in the 1890s too of getting, late 1880s, 1890s, of getting automatic couplers. Like, that was a big deal, and all that, about how that technically made it safer to do that. And so sometimes through arbitration, the employers would say, well, technically that was before we had the automatic coupler, so it's like that was probably responsible for it. Whereas the workers a lot of times would try to say that maybe made it easier, but there were still other hazards, like the tracks would be too close, they would lose arms or legs and that kind of thing. And I don't know, maybe going off a bit of a tangent here, but it was definitely a common issue among them, and probably more so than maybe some other crafts within the railroad industry. Again, I can't say for sure if it was particular, and I don't think it was, but fairly common.
Thank you. There was a question about crossover. I don't know if I asked that or not. Was there much crossover in the trades?
In terms of them working side by side, yeah, that a lot of times, like the switchmen in particular would sometimes, like I said, that they would,
in the 1950s, he would go on to join.
Yeah, that they would be in contact with those across the industry, like the engineers. They would communicate to them what to do, or the conductors and that kind of thing. And sometimes maybe even those in the shop craft trades. That there was definitely, yeah, it's like that was often a point in arbitration too. It's like sometimes the employers would try to paint it as, well, it's a particular craft problem that you're facing. And it's like, well, technically, depending on what our communications are to the engineers, the conductors, it's like it could be everybody's problem. So I guess basically in answer to that question, yes, there was quite a bit of crossover. And there was a lot of times also a system of promotion too. Like they would start off as, like, brakemen a lot of times would start off, or they would start off as brakemen, and then they would try to get promoted to engineer, because it's like that was the best position you could get, that they were the most privileged, and that was considered the most prestigious.
Thank you, Kevin. I apologize for all the craziness here. First, my power went out, then my granddaughters came up. So I apologize for the disruption. It was it was wonderful. I mean, I learned a lot of things. I know how to get on the train, and I know what stop to get off. So I was really excited to learn there was more to it than sitting in the coach and having a cup of tea. Thank you.
Mhm.
I don't see any other questions. I would like to invite all of you to stay for the members meeting. And if you're not a member, please feel free to join and enjoy the day.